Najlepše hvala gospodinu Siniši Malom, ministru financija. A sad imam posebno zadovoljstvo i čast da pozovem našeg specijalnog gosta, gospodina Martijn Keesa. Gospodin Kees je šef misije Međunarodnog monetarnog fonda koji upravo ovih dana završava svoju redovnu posetu Srbiji. I juče i danas imali smo prilike da čujemo pohvalne, ali i kritičke stavove o makroekonomskom stanju u Srbiji. I zato će biti veoma interesantno da saslušamo šta o dosadašnjim reformama, ali i o planovima, misli Međunarodni monetarni fond. Gospodine Kees, izvolite.
I am very pleased to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I greatly appreciate the presence of all of you, in particular, of course, Governor Tabakovic and Minister Mali. Before starting my actual presentation, I do want to say a few words on the war in Ukraine, where we see so much suffering, a large human toll, a large number of refugees, and destruction. The International Monetary Fund, like other international organizations such as the World Bank, is working to help Ukraine in this situation. The IMF board is expected to meet soon to discuss possible financial support. And of course, there are many economic repercussions for many countries. Previous speakers have already mentioned those, and there is much uncertainty. It's not the topic of my presentation, but I did want to mention it at the start. For my presentation, we first looked at the topic of this forum about sustainable development. And when we at the IMF think about sustainable development, we think not only about green development, we also think about development that is financially and fiscally sustainable. Which brings me to the topic of my presentation about fiscal rules. The IMF is supporting Serbia through a policy coordination instrument which covers a large range of reforms. One of them, a critical one, is the formulation of a new fiscal rule. That reform was foreseen earlier for 2020, was then postponed because of the pandemic, but now it is back on the agenda. In this presentation, I want to present our ideas about a new fiscal rule, but I do not want to go through the specific numbers, the specific details of a fiscal rule for Serbia. That is a discussion we are having with the government. What I want to do is present some ideas behind those choices, based on experiences in many countries. In particular, I want to go through what are fiscal rules, why would you want to have them, when do these rules work best. I want to have a look at the European Union and Serbia in terms of the numbers, and then a bit more on the outlook for a fiscal rule in Serbia. The background for having fiscal rules, an important issue there, is what we call debt and deficit bias. What we mean by that is the following. What we often see is that debts and deficits increase in times of crisis, in difficult economic periods. But then they are not reduced as much in the following times when the economy turns back to normal. And so over time, we often see debt going up gradually. But higher and higher debt has important and adverse consequences. It means, in the end, lower growth. It means higher financing costs. It means less stability. What are fiscal rules? They are limits on certain aggregate indicators of fiscal performance. For example, limits on the level of debt, limits on the level of the deficit. Fiscal rules are intended to last for many years, so not just for one budget. And they should be spelled out in clear numerical terms to offer direct guidance for the formulation of policies. A well-known example are the rules of the European Union, the Maastricht Treaty rules, including a debt ceiling at 60% of GDP, a deficit ceiling at 3% of GDP, and there are more rules, for example, a commitment for countries to strive to a balanced budget under normal circumstances, also an excessive deficit procedure. That means that countries that have breached the rules have to get back on track. These rules in the European Union are suspended at this time because of the crisis and are under discussion. What are the objectives of such rules? Well, it is to enhance the credibility of fiscal policy and to control the level of debt, to combat, to avoid that deficit bias and that debt bias that I mentioned, and to prevent the adverse consequences of having high debt. Do fiscal rules actually work? And when do they work best? The IMF has been analyzing this question for years, and we find that fiscal rules indeed have had beneficial effects on the level of debt and the level of deficits. For example, in the October 2021 Fiscal Monitor of the IMF, there is a detailed analysis showing that countries with a debt rule reduce their debt faster and deeper after an episode of debt increases. Also, countries with fiscal rules and that adhere better to fiscal rules have better forecasts of their fiscal balances and deficits. When do these rules work best? They work better across countries typically when they are enshrined in higher level laws or formal agreements, higher formal agreements, so they cannot easily be set aside when an annual budget is prepared. And also then politicians and government officials would have to explain when rules are violated, and it would stimulate a public debate about such situations. An important part of fiscal rules and designing fiscal rules is that there are trade-offs. You would like the fiscal rule to be simple, you would like it to be flexible, and to be enforceable. All these three qualities are important and useful by themselves, but they're not easy to combine. The early fiscal rules typically were very simple. For example, a country would say we must have a balanced budget. But then, since the global financial crisis, since 2011, 2012, we see that many countries adopted more complex fiscal rules to achieve more objectives. In particular, we see more countries with escape clauses that can set aside the rule in a crisis. We see more countries with built-in flexibility through automatic adjustment of the limits on the deficit to the economic cycle, which can be very helpful by allowing fiscal, counter-cyclical fiscal policies. But then more recently, in the last few years, we see a trend again towards more simplicity, because those more complex fiscal rules are also more difficult to implement. Another important consideration is that fiscal rules have important limits in themselves. They are a signaling device, a self-commitment device, but in the end, political will is critical. Political will is needed, otherwise you can always circumvent the rule that exists. In addition, fiscal rules tend to be most effective when they are supported by a wider institutional setting. For example, when there are medium-term fiscal and budgeting frameworks, when there is a high-quality public financial management in place that can support good budgeting, and when there are robust fiscal councils with a strong voice. Now I want to look a bit further at the debt problem itself that these rules are trying to address. And I want to have a look at developments in the European Union since 2007. In this chart, you see countries in the European Union, and we added Serbia, sorted based on the build-up of government debt during 2008-2021. For each country, there is a column, and the bottom dark part of that column is the increase in debt during that period, and you see that from left to right, countries are sorted as they have had a higher increase in debt, from Malta all the way up to Greece. Above this dark part, there is a lighter part of the column that shows the debt that already existed in the country in 2007, which means that the total column, adding up these two parts, shows you debt at the end of 2021. In this chart, the advanced economies in the European Union are blue, advanced economies outside the the advanced economies in the euro area are blue, advanced economies outside the euro area are red, emerging markets are orange, and Serbia is shown in green. What we see, the overall picture, we see a large increase in debt in many countries during this period. Only Sweden and Malta reduced their debt during the period from 2008 to 2021. The average increase across these countries in debt in this period was 31% of GDP, the maximum being Greece, with an increase of nearly 100%. Serbia, shown in green, is in the middle of the chart with an increase in debt of 26% of GDP. Next, I want to split this period of 13 years into three parts. The first part, shown in this slide, shows the change in debt during the global financial crisis. So during the period 2008-2012. The columns again show these same countries, and they show the increase in debt during that period. The dots, the black dots, show the growth in this period. And as you can see, in many countries, growth was very low or negative. Most EU countries built up significant public debt during the global financial crisis, as you would expect in a crisis. What we see is that countries with lower growth typically build up more debt. We see that, well, it's not clear from the picture, but I can tell you that fiscal deficits were a main driver of the higher debt, but countries also experienced higher debt for other reasons, such as recapitalization of companies and banks, and the emergence and fiscal problems related to contingent liabilities, such as SOEs needing further support. Again, in this slide too, we see Serbia sort of in the middle of the group. After the global financial crisis, it was important for countries to restore their fiscal buffers and reduce that. And in this chart, we show what actually happened. The dots again show economic growth, and we see that for most countries, these dots, hence growth, was now well above zero. So higher growth. We also see that many countries did manage to reduce debt. The columns are now negative. And especially the non-euro area countries and emerging market economies worked on debt reduction, or at least avoiding a further increase. We also see in this chart that many countries with the highest level of debts, such as Italy, Greece, Spain, continued to increase their debt, even though most now had reasonable levels of economic growth. And that's a topic I will return to shortly. Serbia, again, shown in green, is more or less in the middle of the group, with reasonable growth and a decline in debt. Then, of course, the last 2 years were the pandemic years. Many countries were not well prepared for this kind of shock financially. They started with a still high level of public debt. Now, this was an unusual shock, and most countries rightly decided to take on more debt to avoid an economic collapse and to avoid or to limit the social problems of the pandemic. As shown in this chart, for many countries, the increase in debt was larger than 10 percentage points. For Serbia, again shown in green, the increase in debt to GDP was smaller than most, in large part because the performance of economic growth was stronger. Now, the increase in debt during the pandemic was smaller than the increase in debt that we saw earlier in the global financial crisis for most countries. But broadly speaking, what we see is that the increase in debt in these two periods, global financial crisis and COVID crisis, was much larger than the reduction in the period in between. Hence, all in all, debt in Europe has now reached unprecedented levels, with all the risk that this entails. I mentioned before that I wanted to come back to the issue of what's happening to high debt countries. Because we saw that several high debt countries saw their debt levels rising even further in times without crisis. And that is not a coincidence. This may be a useful chart for that. We show here the pre-COVID period, 2015-2019. On the horizontal axis, you see government debt in 2019. On the vertical axis, you see average economic growth in 2015-2019. What we see is that countries with higher growth typically had lower debt. Why? Well, first, higher growth reduces your debt in terms of GDP, but also countries with high debt needed to tighten their budgets to pay for the interest costs and to reduce their debts. And that creates a vicious circle where you have fiscal adjustment to reduce debt, which then further reduces your growth. And the lesson of this is the importance of staying out of high debt in the first place. I'll skip the next slide and turn to the situation in Serbia. This slide probably looks very familiar because you've seen similar slides shown in the previous presentations. What we see is that after the increase in debt up to 2015, deficits have been brought under control. We saw the start of a decline in public debt again until the inevitable rise in debt because of the pandemic. But still, we also see that debt remains at a high level and that more needs to be done, especially because in times of crisis, we have seen that debt levels can rise quickly. Now, Serbia did introduce a fiscal rule in the past, in 2011. However, that rule has effectively been suspended from the start. And we think that this is a good time, and we agree with the government that this is a good time to revisit this issue of a new fiscal rule. The government has returned again to a path of debt reduction. We also need to keep in mind that as a country outside the European Union and still catching up in levels of income, Serbia does not have the same kind of secured market access yet that many other countries enjoy. This is why controlling debt remains an ongoing priority. And a new fiscal rule can help achieve that. It requires control of the fiscal balance and control of fiscal risks. I want to offer some thoughts on designing a new fiscal rule for Serbia. The first one is that numerical targets are important because they offer transparency. The anchor of a fiscal rule should tackle the main fiscal vulnerability of the country, in this case, debt. And a starting point for that can be what we call the debt limit, the level of debt that you definitely do not want to get above, say 60%. But given the risk of shocks, the shocks that can increase debt very quickly, you want to target a level of debt well below the ceiling. So you want to anchor your fiscal rule on a debt level much below 60%. And to do that, you set your operational targets for the fiscal balance and possibly on expenditures, certain expenditures, to achieve that. Many countries have also, as I mentioned, used fiscal rules with built-in room for counter-cyclical policies, with a rule formulated in terms of the structural balance. But this can be more complicated, and as I said, there is a trend, a more recent trend, to move away from those again. The coverage is an important topic for any fiscal rule. If the coverage of a fiscal rule is narrow, if large parts, important parts of the public sector are excluded, it's easy to circumvent the rule. And it can also easily lead to more creative accounting to keep expenditures outside the part of the public sector covered by the rule. And with many exclusions or exceptions, a lot of effort would be needed to calculate the deficit under the rule, and the rule can quickly become intransparent. Finally, a few more thoughts on a fiscal rule for Serbia. The first one is the importance of having an escape clause to be able to set aside the rule in times of crisis. The COVID experience showed again how important it is to be prepared for those situations. But then you also need to make sure that the use of an escape clause is strictly limited and that you return to the fiscal rule as soon as possible after the shock. When targets are breached, the fiscal rule targets are breached, it's important to then have a correction. And that can be done in different ways. Easy one is to require the government to explain what happened and to propose actions to address it. You can also go a step further and have automatic correction mechanisms, where, for example, certain revenues or expenditures must adjust because there was a breach. Another very useful tool is to have medium-term budgeting. A medium-term fiscal or budget framework allows you to plan over multiple years how you will get back on track if the targets were breached. Another important component of a fiscal rule is to have a sound budget process and that medium-term fiscal framework. If you want to have systematic planning, if you want to be able to predict your fiscal outcomes, you need those processes to be strong. And finally, fiscal councils play a very important role in informing the public and in holding the government accountable. Fiscal strategies and budgets are forward-looking policies, and they can also be very complex, based on many assumptions, many estimates. And the Fiscal Council is the institution that has the mandate, the resources, and the skills to analyze those complex documents. And thereby they can contribute to a better public debate on public policy. With that, I conclude my presentation. I hope it was a helpful introduction as to why we emphasize the development of new fiscal rules and why we greatly appreciate the government's commitment to work on that with us. Thank you very much.
Najlepše hvala gospodinu Kisu, a ovim je plenarni prepodnevni program završen. Sada najavljujem pauzu i nakon pauze ovde u centralnoj sali počinje panel 1 na kome će se raspravljati o pitanjima održivog finansiranja zdravstvenog sistema. Paralelno u forum sali biće održan panel 2 pod naslovom Industrializacija u funkciji cirkularne, zelene i digitalne ekonomije. Početak oba panela je planiran za 12:15.